In this video, I'm going to criticize the Einstein. It's generally considered to be evil to criticize the Einstein. What the hell, I'll do it anyway. Einstein, you know, everybody thinks he's the greatest genius that ever lived, and he's this wonderful, lovable, fuzzy, cuddly guy, you know, who could do no wrong. Well, let's take a closer look at this. This is the most famous picture of Einstein. What would you think, you know, if you saw a 70-year-old man sticking his tongue out like this? You'd probably be inclined to think the guy was maybe a little crazy, you know, maybe a little childish. Another thing about sticking your tongue out like this can also be considered a kind of a seductive thing a little bit. That's another subject. I'm not going to get into that. I'll get into that later. There's a great campaign out there to deify Einstein on several levels. I've been reading, I just finished this book here, The Private Lives of Albert Einstein. And it's mostly based on a lot of... What is this shit? The letters that he wrote to his ex-wife and stuff. And I had heard rumors before. First, I was a physics major back in college, and one of the professors I mentioned Einstein, and it's like, Einstein. You know, in the world of physics, Einstein has never been considered all that great. Okay, physicist. He's been a controversial figure since he first published his papers back in 1905. And there's never been universal acclaim of him. In the last years of his life, most people were very disappointed with the things he came up with. You know, he only came up with ideas for between about 1905 and about 1912 or 14 or so. Those happened to be the years he lived with his first wife, Melville. And there's a lot of people who believe he got a lot of these ideas about relativity and the photoelectric effect and all of these things he got from her. And there's also a tremendous amount of evidence that a lot of these ideas he got from, well, it's known, he got a lot of these ideas from other people. He just kind of packaged them all together in a way that was explained a few things, and he called it relativity. And there were some physicists who were impressed with that. It was never universally claimed. There are actually, here's just some of the criticisms. You know, most scientists in history don't have that much controversy about them. They're not constantly being accused of plagiarism, and their theories aren't so controversial. I don't know of any scientist that is as controversial as Einstein. Yet you don't hear about that. This is just some of the criticisms. I'm not going to stop long enough to read this. Just giving you an idea to show you that there is a lot of criticism about Einstein, and there are all kinds of evidence that he was not the first. He was not the first one to come up with these theories, but he gets all the credit for it. Of course, even this stuff here is downplayed. It always has to be downplayed. Like you notice here, it says his wife Sylvia Marek have made any contribution to Einstein work, although the question is not considered by any foundation by serious scholars. That's a complete total lie. There are many serious scholars who consider that, especially in the Slavic world, and there's considerable evidence of it. In fact, Einstein gave her all the money for his Nobel Prize, and which is interesting. I wonder if his handlers told him to do that, to try to shut her up, buy her silence. And they said, go ahead and give her that money, you know, that'll keep her from talking, and we'll take care of you, don't worry about it. You don't need the money, we'll take care of you. Now, it was about in the 30s is when Einstein started getting all this fame, but that was coming mostly from the press, and we all know who runs the press, don't we? So Einstein, 90% of his fame as the greatest genius that ever lived mostly comes from the media. Not physicists don't normally consider him that. Most physicists consider other people like Max Planck and others and Isaac Newton to be much greater geniuses and contributors to physics than Einstein. But the media has made him out to be the greatest being that ever lived, and they like to show these complex physics formulas and stuff. It shows, and the average layman has no clue what the hell they're like. Wow, man, you must have been a genius to be able to write this down. Well, somebody with a PhD in physics can understand these things, but the layman can't comprehend this. Now, the fact of the matter is, Einstein, he was a genius. He was very intelligent. In order to get into upper division physics, you have to have a high IQ. There's a lot of students that do very well in high school. They're like straight A students, and they decide they want to go into physics. And that's where you separate the men from the boys when you start going into physics. Because there's a lot of bright people who get top of their class type students, and they start getting into physics, and then their grades start to slip a little bit when they start getting into physics. They're maybe no longer A students. Now, even those that still get A students there, but then when they start getting into upper division physics, then that's where their grades start going down. When Einstein started studying upper division physics, he was like the top of his class, through most of his life. And everyone thought he was a genius, very well. But then when he started getting into upper division physics, his grades were mediocre. They weren't all that great. And he never did complete a PhD. He was given an honorary PhD years later by people I can't mention. But they made a bigger deal. Certain people were making a big deal of his theories and he couldn't get a job when he got out of college. One of the reasons that he wouldn't get any recommendations from his professors. You have to have a degree to get a job in physics, and the only way to get a job is you got to get recommended by your professors. They wouldn't recommend him. And one of the reasons that they wouldn't recommend him is because he had an attitude problem. He had this kind of superiority complex. He would often be rude to his professors, and that's not a good thing to do. I mean, if you want to make it in the field of physics, he was finally one of his, I'll say it, Jewish friends created a position for him. Jews do take care of each other, and I will, that's, I suppose you could say that I don't necessarily have a problem so much with that if they want to try to help each other out, but I have a problem with it when they start wanting to put other people down. Now, of course, now I'm getting into forbidden topics. I can't say that, but anyway, Jews do have a tendency to do stuff, especially if they're coming from wealthy Jewish families. Einstein came from a well-off Jewish family. And even though he himself was not very much of a strict Jew, still, Jews help each other out. I'm going to take a little risk here and add something. During World War I, the average German was, maybe not quite starving, but they weren't well off. They had to ration food and everything. And when Einstein's family, they had all plenty. They invited people over and they feasted. Everybody else was starving, except his family, And I don't know, people always say it's anti-Semitism when you say these things, but of course it's always anti-Semitism. Anytime you criticize Einstein, it's anti-Semitism. There's no legitimate reason to criticize Einstein. Anyone who criticizes Einstein is an anti-Semite, of course. Even though there's been a few Jews who have. Anyway, he eventually started getting a job, but he started out slowly. He started getting some recognition from his theories of relativity and other things. And so some people did respect and admire him. It seemed like he got a lot more prestige and thumbs up from Jews and Jewish physicists and non-Jewish physicists. There were many people that were quite hostile to him. I will say one thing, the more I studied Einstein, the more absolutely disgusted I started getting with some of his behavior. Einstein has, a lot of people think he was real nice. He could be very kind and charming, outwardly, especially towards women. He wasn't usually so charming with men. In fact, he was often quite rude to men. But he was very charming to women, especially if they were good-looking women. Some people say, well, he'd go for any woman, whether she was beautiful or ugly. Well, I think he would to a degree, but he liked young women. And he would use women, and he would throw them away when he was done with them. Now, this is psychopathic, sociopathic type behavior. And the more I look into Einstein, the more convinced I am that this guy has psychopathic behavior. And a lot of people say, well, he would be very kind. Well, he would be kind if he had something to gain from it. Like being kind and flattery to women. He was a good writer. He had good writing skills. He would write these flowery love letters to women. And he would just toss them away. And his first wife, I was just absolutely appalled at the way he treated her. His mother hated this woman. And I thought that was despicable, the way she acted. Because this is a woman that he's thinking of marrying, possibly. And I think the only reason he married her is because he got her pregnant. And I think he was afraid that she was going to make trouble for him if he didn't marry her. But he got her pregnant the first time. And this woman was pleading with, I'm so lonely. This woman, Miss Millville, was a rising star in physics. She was one of the first women to ever study upper division physics. Looking at her, she actually looks smarter than he does. He's kind of looking dopey, kind of. She looks much more calculating. She also looks a little sinister, too, though, doesn't she? Kind of. Like she could be a little evil. He made one quote, one letter to her. He was talking about us and our dark souls. Interesting quote. One of the most puzzling things about Einstein, if he was such an extreme genius, then how come everything he came up with after he broke up with his first wife was basically shit? And that's not debatable. I mean, that's pretty much universal in the world of physics. Everything he wrote after that was just considered to be just garbage. It was just, the theories were nonsense. They were ridiculous. The calculations were often completely off. And that's unusual. If somebody is such a super genius, they come up with these great breakthroughs while they're married to this woman, and then they break up with her, and then everything they come up after that is just pure crap. And she probably would have gotten a degree in it, and she hadn't met Einstein. He kind of screwed her up on many levels. She was going through stress when she was going to take her exams. Is when she got pregnant, and that was scandalous in those days. The early 1900s, being pregnant out of wedlock, especially in the university setting, that was scandalous. So she had to deal with that kind of thing while she's studying very hard physics and upper division math classes. That's not easy, and of course she didn't end up getting very good grades. But she was pregnant. He never went to see her. I don't know if he ever went to see her when she was pregnant. He'd write all these letters that he loved her and I care so much, but his behavior didn't play out that he really had any feelings for her. It was just like he would send her his laundry, and she would do his laundry, and she'd send him food, and she took care of him, and he would do that. And then he had another girlfriend before, and he jilted this other girl. Everybody thought he was going to marry her, and he was telling her how much he loved her, and everything. He just tossed her aside like yesterday's garbage when he, no longer needed her, and he found somebody better. And he had a tendency to do that to women. He was definitely a womanizer all his life. But anyway, he tossed this woman aside. She got pregnant, and then she had a difficult childbirth, never went to see her. The child later on got sick with scarlet fever, which is pretty dangerous in those days. There's strong indication he never saw this girl one time. Nobody ever knows what happened to her, but apparently either she died or she was secretly given away. It was all about protecting Einstein, his reputation. Because if it got out that he had an illegitimate child, that would ruin his reputation. And Einstein trying to protect himself, and others around him were protecting him. It was like he was already being set up to be the mascot for a proof of Jewish intellectual superiority, and they didn't want anything to destroy that. There's this people and there's two guys in here who are his protectors. This later on in life, this Helen Dukas and Otto Nathan, they were in charge of protecting him even after he was dead. No one was allowed to criticize Einstein or put out. All of his letters were sealed. The letters, I mean, he was horrible. He was cruel to some of these women. And his ex-wife, he would say horrible things to her. And all this stuff was kept under seal. Nobody was allowed. And they had this foundation. You know, as long as these two, this Dukas and Nathan were alive, nobody was allowed to. Even people like the son of Milva, Einstein's grandchildren and children tried to publish some of these letters, and they were doing it mostly. Einstein's youngest son ended up dying in a horrible death. He spent years in an insane asylum. Einstein never went to see him. Over 30 years, I don't think he ever saw his son once. That just shows you, a lot of people didn't even know he had two sons. A lot of people didn't even know he had a son. That just shows you about the kind of psychopathic. But he didn't care about his own. He acted like he cared about his sons, but then he acted like he didn't. He was definitely a womanizer. And if you look at this clip here, this I'm absolutely is just amazing. I mean, look at, he sees this young girl. I mean, she doesn't even have breasts. She looks like she's 10, 12 years old. He's like, and then he's reaching for her, and there's a boy there. He's like, pushes her away, and he's reaching for, this is like a 10, 12-year-old girl. Most men, if they were to do something like this, anyone other than Einstein probably would have been kicked out of the place, and maybe some people might even have him arrested, for behaving like this. I mean, there are several people who believe that Einstein died of syphilis. He had an aneurysm, which is often caused by syphilis. He had there was signs he was losing it. In the last 20 years of his life, he was losing his faculties. And several women in his life also showed signs of mental dementia after years. This is often a case of syphilis. So his womanizing and philandering probably not only got him syphilis, but he probably spread it to his ex-wife and several others. In fact, syphilis can often be passed down to children. And his one son went insane and spent years in an insane asylum. It could be that he had syphilis also. Because sometimes you can catch it, it could be passed down through childbirth. I don't know if his ex-wife was having sex with her son or not. Einstein, I wouldn't put it past him having sex with children. There's nothing at this point that would... he was called a humanitarian. Well, he did outwardly say some anti-war stuff. Some things, sounded like pretty good things. He was opposed to World War I and World War II. He was very much opposed. Yeah, well, see, then he reversed a lot of the things in World War II. He was talking about pacifism, but then he was talking about, we need to kill all the Nazis and blow them up. And he secretly worked for the U.S. Navy once he went to the U.S. and was helping them develop explosives. And, of course, there's the famous letter to Franklin Delano Roosevelt encouraging him to develop nuclear weapons because they were afraid that the Germans were developing them, so we had to get them first. There's never been 1 ounce of evidence that the Germans were developing nuclear weapons. There is indication they were looking into it as a source of power. They were looking into nuclear power. And there was that one incident where they're trying to get heavy water in Norway. But there never really was any evidence that the Germans were making nukes. And you'd think after the war was over, the Manhattan Project continued to develop nukes after the war was over. So obviously somebody had some diabolical schemes here. Now some people try to say Einstein was all appalled about this, and that he wrote another letter trying to warn Roosevelt, oh, don't, he was all concerned about this. But if you actually read the second letter, he was concerned about a lack of communication. One thing you can tell, it was his friends that were putting this on, because Einstein at this, I think, was pretty much out of it. But he still had this name was carried a lot of weight, because he was the Einstein, and his name carried a lot of weight. So even though he may not even wrote the letter, somebody else might have wrote it and just he signed it. But anyway, they were concerned about a lack of communication between the scientists and the committee. You know, they weren't concerned about killing civilians or anything. That didn't seem. The woman that's Dukas, who was personal slave, his henchwoman. In fact, there's strong indications that he was also having sex with her too. Well, of course, any woman he could get his hands on. But well, she said that when she heard that they had finally dropped the nuke on this new kind of bomb on Japan, she told Einstein about this. His only reaction was oy vey, you know, alas, and that's all he said. There's other people who try to say, oh, he was all upset about it. He locked himself in a room for months. I have found no evidence he didn't. See, there's so many lies made up about Einstein, and they want to deify Einstein. You know, he was opposed to war. Well, you know, and then again, you know, he hung out with Gandhi supposedly for a little bit, and he put out this stuff about, he's anti-war. But then again, you know, it's anti-violence for the people. Not obviously, he wasn't opposed for the government, the police using violence, because he helped the military develop bombs and he encouraged FDR to develop nukes. So, I mean, how could he call himself a pacifist? Obviously, he wasn't a true pacifist deep down inside, or he wouldn't be promoting nukes. Einstein's been called the father of nuclear weapons. And you look at this picture here, actually that E equals MC squared, he didn't even come up with that. Now, there's a few other things about Einstein. He definitely had a love of luxury, and he had a love of pleasure. He did have some musical talents, I'll give him that much. He apparently was a fairly decent violinist. I never heard him play, so I don't know how good he really was, but a lot of people said he was a pretty decent violinist. Of course, then again, that's probably been exaggerated too. And the funny thing is, after this Dukas and Nathan died, all of his papers and everything were turned over to Israel, which apparently was part of his will. And that's interesting. His divorce papers are sealed in, you know. And that's another thing. There were many people who believed there was domestic violence, that Einstein was beating Melva. And there was indications that he was physically violent, as well as cheating on her. There's no question he was cheating on her, and there's strong indications he was also violent. And that's all, and apparently there's evidence of that, and that's all sealed. You're not allowed to know that. And see that, and there's been a lot of people who've been very frustrated trying to get to the truth about Einstein, because it's sealed. You're not allowed to know anything about Einstein's darker side. And that bothers me. You know, there's a lot of other characters in history, we can find out all about their dark side, but Einstein, it's forbidden. You're not allowed to know anything about his dark side. Anytime Einstein would act kind or act like a humanitarian, or he's opposed to war, there was usually some alternative reason for why he was acting that way, or why he was being promoted as being that way. A lot of that, I don't think it was even his doing. I think other people, it was like, in the last years of his life, it was like he was being handled. It was like he was kind of like losing his marbles, and he was being handled. He was being controlled. This Dukas wouldn't let him talk to reporters. How come she wouldn't let him talk to reporters? Obviously, they were afraid he was going to say something that they didn't want him to say. Something that would make him look like an ass, or maybe leak some information they didn't want leaked, or something that would spoil the perfect image that they wanted everybody to believe of him. You know, overall, I'm pretty disgusted with Albert Einstein. I mean, he maybe made some contributions. It's hard to know how much real contributions to physics he made, considering that about 80% of everything said about him is just complete BS. So it's hard to know the full extent of just how much of a great genius he really was. Perhaps one of the most disturbing things about Einstein is there are indications he did have syphilis. And Einstein was intelligent. I mean, I think his intelligence has been exaggerated, but he was intelligent. Judging by the letters he wrote, he did know a lot about biology, and he did know a lot about diseases and medicine. And he almost certainly, if he did have syphilis, and I think it's probably 80-90% chance he did, then he also probably at least 80-90% chance he knew he had it. And if he did have syphilis, and he did know he had it, which he probably did, he's going out there having sex with every single woman he can get his hands on. Okay, this is kind of putting him in the monster category. Okay, and then he's even apparently going after young girls as well. He had a very strange relationship with his 2 stepdaughters. His second marriage, his second wife had 2 daughters, and all accounts are they were very, very close. Too close. Both these women were married, and they lived with Einstein. They didn't live with their husbands. Their husbands lived elsewhere. In fact, I think one of them was even in Europe part of the time. But they didn't live with their husbands. They lived with Einstein and their mother. Kind of bizarre, isn't it? And the one young daughter, there was a lot of strange things. The people would catch her by surprise, and she'd run under the table and hide. Why was she doing that? Was she partially undressed or something? The younger daughter also died young. Did she die of syphilis? Now, I know these people, and I know who's behind this, and I can tell you right now, they aren't going to allow the truth to be told about Einstein. I mean, these people are capable of mass murder. Doctoring up the laws of physics is insignificant. It's not going to bother their conscience at all. And if that means that we have to be stuck with these flawed theories for the next 300-400 years, so be it.